Looking at Exodus chapter 21, going through 23:19, that's what we call the book of the covenant. But I think it's beyond any shadow of a doubt that the greatest mission anybody ever accomplished, a person, was Jesus Christ. And he came and he put away sin. He dealt with sin for us. In my opinion, the second greatest mission by another person was Moses. Because what Moses has done is God is using him to form a nation coming out of Egypt. And it's at least 2 million, could be up to 4 to 5 million people that were brought out under Moses to form a nation. Now, we have to look at, when you read the Bible, you'll notice one thing. There's 3 different times in the Bible that there has been a cluster of miracles, where there's been a magnitude of miracles. And the reason the miracles are being done is to certify that the messenger of God is confirmed by God, that the messenger is sent by God, and that his message is authoritative from God. Because you have the first time you run into a cluster of miracles is right here in coming out of Egypt. God used Moses as his messenger to bring the people out of Egypt to form a nation, and now he's given the law. So it's as if God is confirming through miracles the law. The second time you see a multitude of miracles in the Bible is during Elisha and Elijah. And they represent the prophets. They were confirming the office of the prophet. And so they were doing a lot of miracles. So what do you have? The first 2 instances of massive miracles is the law and the prophets to confirm the messenger. And then you have the next time you see a multitude of miracles is during the ministry of Jesus Christ, who came and he's given the Christ law. He's given the law of Jesus Christ and putting away sin. And that's what we have here. Remember last week when we looked at chapter 20, here we have the people at the base of the mountain. They're at the base of the mountain ready to receive the law. And what happens? In verse 18 of chapter 20, it says, "Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, 'You speak with us, and we will hear you, but let not God speak with us, lest we die.'" And we saw last week that that word for witness is a certain word, a unique word in Hebrew, which means it goes beyond the normal senses of a person, that witness. It means, it's confirmed to me by studying this, that what it's saying is that all the people, every single person that came out of Egypt heard God's voice. It goes beyond the senses. God is able to speak to every single person in the inner chambers of your heart. And I believe that every single person that's ever been born, that's ever lived on this earth, knows when God is speaking to them. And that's why no one will have an excuse. But this is what's happening. And we all know that everybody that came out of Egypt, they all were not saved. There were some that were saved and some were not, yet they all heard the word of God, the law coming. So we have the law. Now notice the law. This is what they call the book of the covenant. And notice that 21:1 starts out the law concerning servants. Now why does he start the book of the covenant out with servants? Law concerning servants. You would think he would start the law out with the law, murder, kidnapping, or anything like that, but he starts the book of the covenant out with how to treat servants. In 21:1 it says, "Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year he shall go out free and pay nothing." And he keeps going on, giving through the first 11 verses, giving how you are to treat a slave. And why he does that is because the Israelites were slaves themselves in Egypt. And this is a theme you're going to see, especially in the Pentateuch, when you get to Deuteronomy. Remember how I treated you in Egypt, and he's saying, as slaves, I brought you out of slavery of Egypt. Now I want you to treat everybody as I treated you. It's as if he's saying, do not mistreat aliens. Do not mistreat people that are going to be in slavery. And so we got to remember, when the Bible speaks like this, especially when you get into the law, it's not saying slavery's okay. It's not saying certain institutions that are happening is okay, or divorce is okay, or anything like that. What it's saying is the point of these regulations, especially starting with slavery, is not to question the existence of these social conditions, but is to give clear guidelines for how people should act in such circumstances, how they should be treated. He's not saying it's okay to have slavery. It's okay to get a divorce. It's okay for polygamy. That's not what the Bible's saying. When the Bible speaks of certain circumstances like this, it's just giving the reality of the situation at hand, and this is how you should act in these situations to treat other people that are stuck in this situation. Because when you look at the New Testament, you see Philemon, and that's the slave that ran away from his master and met Paul, and Paul is sending him back to his master, saying he is our brother in Christ. His heart has been changed, so treat him as such. And so what's going on is, you see, we can make all the laws through governing authorities to abolish slavery. And actually, William Wilberforce, I believe is his name, he was a Christian in England, and he was instrumental in breaking the slavery institution in England. So God will raise people up through the government, through the governing authorities, to do away with certain institutions that are against God's word. But for us, the important thing is that we need to understand that it's the human heart that needs to change. And that the world's not getting better, it's getting worse. But that's the important part to remember when you read through the law. It is the human heart that needs to change. In verses 12 through 17, he goes through laws concerning violence. He talks about murder, he talks abuse of parents, and kidnapping. Now remember, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. When you're looking at the law, it's made not only for individuals, but more for the community. It's made for the nation that they're speaking to. In other words, if people are breaking the law, if there is a mass, well, Chicago is a good example here of murder. If you had a city, no, seriously, if you had a nation that was characterized of murder, okay, God's going to bring judgment eventually unless those people repent. Not because he wants to wipe out that nation, but because he's protecting the other nations around him. So when we see certain nations throughout the Bible, throughout history, that have been wiped out, and usually the cause is because they have fallen into a pattern that's characterized most of the people in that city. The moral fabric has eroded and judgment is around the corner. That's the importance of the law. But you look at Exodus chapter 21 and you'll notice these verses. Let me read them. Chapter 21, verses 23 through 25. It says, "But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." This is the basic principle here, centers on intention. But Jesus addresses this in Matthew, in the Beatitudes. Remember, this is where that famous eye for eye is formulated right here, and Jesus addresses this. Now remember, when Jesus came, he's going to reinterpret the law. He's not abolishing the law, but he's reinterpreting it. And he's correcting some of the mistranslations. When you go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 through 42, you'll recognize these verses. This is what Jesus says concerning the verses we've just read in the law. "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. So what Jesus, he is correcting these verses right here, because people were use these verses. It's meant for, remember what the law is meant for, priority, is for the nation, is for the city or the village that's being talked about. It is for individuals, but it's mainly for the corporate group. And so what happens, and this is really convicting, at least it was really convicting for me when I looked at this, is what Jesus is doing here. Jesus is correcting a misinterpretation of the Old Testament law, but he's not abolishing it. He's just correcting it. Jesus is speaking against the practice of applying the judicial principle that the punishment should fit the crime to the personal sphere. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, when you look at Exodus, it's meant for the nation. It's meant for governing authorities to exact justice. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Punishment should fit the crime. He's not talking about, well, what happened with Israel, especially the Pharisees in the first century, they were using it as a personal sphere, within the personal sphere. Christians, what Jesus is saying is, someone slaps you on the cheek, turn the other. If someone takes a tunic, give them your cloak also. He's saying Christians are to forgive and do good to those who wrong them individually. And this is where it kind of convicted me here. We are not to take upon ourselves the task of righting the wrongs of the world, as if we should personally dispense justice corporately. We're talking about the judicial branch. We're talking about the court system. That's what this eye for an eye is for. And so what we see when you read through the law, you're going to see why it's like, do not take bribes. Do not defend the rich as you would defend the poor. He goes on, and what the law is pointing out is the court system needs to be fair. And what happened is that they're taking that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth that should be within the court system, and they're using it personally. Well, Irma wronged me, so I'm going to pay her back what she has done to me. Cliff has wronged me. I'm going to pay him back what he's done to you, instead of letting the court system do its job. Because in Romans 13, Paul says all the governing authorities are appointed by God. And usually when a nation starts going down that moral degrade, it's because the court system is corrupt. So as Christians, now this is the high standard that Christ is saying. This is how the law should be applied. This is a high standard for each one of us. Christians are to forgive individually in our area of influence and not leave it to the court system. And in other words, it's easy for me to say something like this. Well, this person committed this horrendous crime. I know this person. I'm going to let the court system deal with it. Maybe that crime is against me. I'm going to let the court system deal with it. Instead of me going to that person and forgiving that person, no matter what the court system does. You see, and what we do at times, I'm guilty of it, what we do at times is say, I'm not going to forgive that person. I'm going to let the court system turn that person away in prison for the next 20 years. And we kind of subconsciously say, I don't have to forgive that person. What Christ is saying is, if somebody's wronged you, and yes, take it to court if you have to, let the court system deal with it, but I want you to forgive that person. I don't care what the court system does. I want you personally to go forgive that person if they've done you wrong. You're not let off the responsibility of forgiving somebody. I watch a lot of those detective shows, and when you watch those detective shows, if it's a horrendous crime or something, you notice it's really easy to spot many times who a true Christian is. Because they might have a family member that was murdered or something drastic happened to them, and then the person that's done that crime is in the court system, and they're in the trial and all that. And you can tell who the Christian is, because the Christian will forgive that person. before the sentence even comes down. And I have to say, if something happened to one of my daughters, I can be honest with you and say it'd be really hard for me to forgive that person. But you know what happens when we're Christians? I believe this firmly. And it's the same with modern. What happens is God would give you the grace at that time to forgive that person. And what happens when that happens? He gets the glory. But looking more at the law, he goes into chapter 22, and those verses 1 through 17 is about property. The law is concerned property. Possessions are important, they are, and God has certain laws for that, but they do not have the same importance as human life. That's why when something is done against human life is sacred. There's more drastic punishment involved because we're made in the image of God. All of us are made in the image of God. When you go through, let's see, verses 18 through 31, and this is where I kind of wanted to spend some time in, chapter 22, verses 18 through 31. It's moral and ceremonial principle. What does that have to do with anything? You know what that's telling the ancient Israelites? And now that the Christ has come, now that Christ has put away sin, and now it applies to us in a different way. But what they're saying, anybody reading this law back in Israel would understand that verses 18 through 31 deals with all of life is rooted in worship. Every aspect of life. Your secular job is part of worship. Coming here on Sunday morning is part of worship. Bringing your sacrifice to the temple, I'm talking about them, was part of worship. How they treated their family members was part of worship. All life is rooted in worship. And I'm going to tell you, when you're a Christian and you're born again and you have that strong relationship with Jesus Christ and you're thinking about Him, you're meditating on Him, it's worship. You worship 24/7. When you read the Bible, when you're praying at home or in a group, it's worship. When you come here for corporate worship, it's worship. When you have good thoughts about another person, guess what? That's worship. When you do something good for another person, Christian or not, that's worship. And that's why our life in heaven is going to be one of 24/7 worship. Because we're going to have no sin. It's when sin gets stuck in our mind, when sin is involved with our actions, it's not worship. Because remember, what did Moses keep saying to Pharaoh? Moses kept telling Pharaoh, let my people go that they may worship me. You see, God brings us out of the world. He brings us out of the kingdom of Satan, places us into the kingdom of Christ for what reason? Not to meet our needs. That's a good priority. He loves to do that, but that's not the main reason He saves us. The main reason He saves us is that we will worship Him. That's what we were designed for. That's what Adam and Eve were doing in the garden, and that's what we will be doing in heaven for eternity, is worshiping the Lord. We're not going to be sitting on clouds. Plug your ears, Cliff. You're not going to be playing your trombone 24/7. That's not worship. It's worship when you do it, but you see, sometimes we have this picture in our mind that heaven would be sitting on clouds playing harps. That must be boring. That's how people look at it sometimes when they're not saved. But heaven is the most exciting thing that we are ever going to be involved with, and your whole life is going to be nothing but worship. And when you break down the book of the covenant, it's all about worship. Everything's about worship. Remember, let my people go that they may worship me. A couple more things when we get to, where is it? He talks about magic, he talks about false religion, don't go to a sorcerer, things like that. He's talking about voodoo theologies, like I like to call it. He warns them the practice of magic was universal in the ancient world, it's universal here today. And so I think about Moses. And remember when Moses, now hear me out here, Moses God calls to him from the bush. And he says, Moses, I want you to go back and deliver my people from Egypt. I want you to go to Pharaoh, and I want you to knock on the palace door and say, let my people go. And what was Moses' response? Well, Lord, they're not going to listen to me. It's as if God didn't already figure that out. Oh, thanks you for telling me that, Moses. I didn't realize that. No, what did God tell Moses? Remember, all the cluster of miracles is to confirm the messenger of God, the message. God says, Moses, throw down your staff. So he throws down the staff and he turns into a snake. And then what does God tell him? He says, pick up the snake by the tail. Now this took faith on Moses' part. Because if I was Moses, I'd say, well, let me at least try and take him by the neck so he doesn't whip around and bite me. But Moses does what God says, and he takes the snake by the tail and turns back into a rock. Then he says, put your hand into your, like Napoleon, put your hand into your bosom. Take it out and it's leprous. He says, put your hand back in. He puts it back in and takes it back out and it's clean. And God is telling him, they're going to believe you that I sent you because of the miracles that I'm going to do. And so Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go that they may worship the Lord in the desert. And then all the miracles start happening to confirm to Pharaoh, to the people in Egypt, and to the people of Israel that he is a divine messenger sent by God because of all these miracles. Satan cannot do miracles. Because what does it say in the New Testament? Lying, signs, and wonders. Satan can't make something out of nothing. Satan can't make an axe head float. Satan can't control the natural laws. God's the only one that does miracles. And so what happens when the magicians throw their rods down on the ground, they turn into snakes. 2 snakes. And God's snake eats up the other 2 snakes. Now first of all, God, when he goes into Pharaoh, he throws down his staff and he turns into a snake. I guarantee you, Janus and Jambres, what's their names, the 2 magicians, they probably gone and said, is that all you got, Moses? Because we do the same thing. But what they did, and I searched this out, what they did was they had these staffs that had the snake inside the staff. And so when they threw their staff down, they had like a little switch there. And the snake would come out of the staff. See, it was all magic. It's all sleight of hand. Only God can do miracles. Verses 29 through 31 is about worship. Again, everything's about worship. Everything you do, everything you think is worship. It says your firstborn offerings, your firstborn holiness. He's saying give your best to God. And let me say one more thing about the law. In John, the Gospel of John, starting at John chapter 5, verse 45 through 47. It says, do not think that I shall accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust. For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? What Jesus is telling the Pharisees is that Moses wrote about Jesus. The law is about Christ. The law, the whole Bible points to the coming of Christ. What Christ did is he fulfilled the law completely. And now when we accept Christ, his righteousness, his perfect life is given to us. That's the only reason anybody goes to heaven, because of what Christ has done. But he's saying right here, Moses wrote about it. So always remember that when you're going through the Pentateuch. Moses is talking about Christ. The law points to Jesus Christ. But look at when you go to John 8:56. Go to John 8:56. Notice what it says. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Now think about that. Abraham rejoiced to see Christ's day, and he saw it. Abraham saw the coming of Christ. This is what everybody in the Old Testament are saved just the same way we are. You're either looking forward to the Messiah in the Old Testament, you're placing your faith, because that's what Hebrews 4:2 says. The gospel was preached to them. The Old Testament just as it was preached to us, except they didn't receive it by faith. The people that understood that they're sinners and that they were looking for the coming Messiah to put away sin, however that was going to happen, were saved. We look back to what Christ has done. One more, and that is in John 12:41. So right now, Jesus is saying, Moses wrote about me, Abraham, back in Genesis, rejoiced to see my day. Then you go to John 12:41, and this is one of my favorites right here. In John 12:41, he says, these things Isaiah said when he saw his glory and spoke of him. Now what he's saying there is, I remember when Isaiah went into the temple in Isaiah chapter 6, 1-8. Isaiah goes into the temple and he sees the Lord high and lifted upon the throne, and his robe covering the temple. This is what they're talking about right here in John chapter 12. He's saying the things Isaiah saw was me, was Jesus Christ. This is who Isaiah saw. So everything points to Christ. Let me do this one more thing, because we're talking about Christ and the law. Remember leprosy. You had leprosy, you had, especially in Leviticus chapters 13, I believe it's 12, 13, 14, something like that. You have these long chapters about laws of leprosy. Now notice what happens here. In Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45. It says, now a leper came to him, Jesus, imploring him, kneeling down to him and saying to him, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, I am willing, be cleansed. As soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. And he strictly warned him and sent him away at once, and said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing those things which Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Now think what's happening here. This is huge, what's happening here. Jesus' touch had a transforming and purifying power, so that rather than becoming unclean himself when he touched that leper, he cleanses the leper and freed him from his leprosy. In the Old Testament, that which is unclean defiles that which is clean. You see that in Malachi. In this instance, Jesus, as the clean one, purifies what is unclean by his transforming touch. This is why the Pharisees were freaking out. Who is this guy? He not only is with sinners, but now he's touching lepers. He's unclean himself. Jesus' transformation of the leper by touching him suggests, it's what they all should have caught, that a new stance suggests a new stance, a new way of looking at the law now. Because Christ said, we're under Christ's law. We filter everything through Jesus Christ now. He's the one that kept the law. The law of leprosy must be interpreted in light of the coming of Jesus himself, instead of understanding Jesus in terms of the requirements laid down for leprosy. And that's, if you get anything out of this message, get what I'm about to say right now. The law must be interpreted in light of the coming of Jesus Christ. The Old Testament law points to Christ and is fulfilled in him. So the law must be interpreted in light of Christ, not vice versa. In other words, when Jesus came and he did the Beatitudes, he said, eye for an eye, you're doing this all wrong, that's not what it means. And he corrected the eye for an eye. Murder, not only doing the actual act, but if you hate somebody in your heart, you've committed murder. He's retranslating the law. And it's what we call the law of Christ.